In truth, I hardly know her, though she's had a key to my house for the past 5 years, and she comes every 2 weeks to do the housekeeping that I just don't want to do myself. I ran by the house this week to make a quick wardrobe change to have a shirt and tie that was not wearing part of my lunch to my next meeting. And there on the kitchen counter lay the broken pieces of an old hand-painted china plate. And she was very embarrassed and offered, "Can I replace it?" No, it had been a gift from an elderly aunt who had given it to me more than 30 years ago, just before she died, and not the kind of guy that would have gone out and purchased a hand-painted piece of china to hang on my wall, regardless of its value or artistry. I'm gay-friendly, I'm just not a member of the club. That's just not something that I would normally do if it hadn't been something I associated with one of my beloved family members. So I just assured my housekeeper not to worry about it. Accidents happen, it's no big deal. These things come and go. But when I got home that night, she had left her paycheck behind with a heartfelt note of apology. Now, I'm going to get the money to her because, of course, I'm certain she's not out cleaning people's houses for entertainment value. She needs that money, and I'm going to make sure she gets it. But what has captured my attention about this little exchange is that this person I hardly know has such a clear set of values, that she's so earnest about taking responsibility for her actions and taking responsibility at a level that's more than anyone could reasonably expect. They don't talk about it much now, but for a long time, until a couple of centuries ago, Catholics used to talk about deeds of supererogation, which literally means going above and beyond what is required of you, but it carries with it the implication in religious language of doing more than even God expects of you. I mention it here because there are very few opportunities I have to use the word supererogation, and it seemed to fit here. But in a world where the Catholic hierarchy has moved pedophile priests from one place to another to avoid detection, where even my former denomination, the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, hid a known pedophile denominational leader to protect him from criminal prosecution, where elected officials in this ostensibly Christian nation will torture prisoners, make the decision to turn the mentally ill out onto the streets in midwinter to die from exposure, that will make the decision to invade foreign countries on false pretenses, and where even people that you have supported yourself in times of their greatest need will betray you for nothing more than whatever pleasure they get from feeling some power by hurting you. Into this comes a stranger with more evidence of character than I generally see in members of Congress, that I have seen in cathedrals, and sometimes even in your own backyard at a family gathering. Now, I'm currently preparing to go on what is realistically my first real speaking tour, and I have the good fortune of doing that in Scotland and England. So I asked my Scottish host to give me some readings that would help me to understand my audience in Glasgow, where I'll be for the first 2 lectures. And he sent me several articles about the recent vote for Scottish independence, but he wrapped that up with a suggestion that I read a book by the British comedian and author Russell Brand entitled Revolution. I regularly have lunch with our good friend Dr. Hedrick, and this past week when we were having lunch, he asked me, as he usually does, "What are you reading these days?" And I felt obligated to come up with several other things to avoid mentioning the fact that the book in my bookcase was Russell Brand's Revolution, because Brand is best known as an alcoholic and drug-addicted, womanizing, famous millionaire movie star. And I wasn't sure that I really wanted to identify that book as what I was currently reading. But I have to admit, I've really liked Brand's book and have been shocked to discover how much I have in common with him. other than the alcoholic, drug-addicted, womanizing, famous millionaire movie star part. Brand became a famous wealthy person on the strength of his telling of stories about his exploits as a spoiled and self-serving addict. But this book is about his recovery in AA, his discovery of a largely rational and social justice-based spirituality. Now, he's no intellectual, but he has become an avid reader, and he's been willing to analyze his personal faults in a very public way. Like a lot of us, he found it increasingly necessary to dismiss the creedal religions that have lost all credibility for us in the face of both the reality of our experience and in the presence of scientific knowledge, looking at the suffering in the world caused by both irrational religion and self-serving governments, as well as by the super wealthy. You realize that that system of religion really has to go. In sobriety, he has found the gratitude we so often hear expressed by former addicts who find the bliss of sobriety and a life lived in orientation to reality. But again, like many of us, he's found it very hard to tell his friends about it. That when you try to give an account to your friends about your total change in perspective, that how you have become a spiritual person, and instead of the things that Brand was famous for doing, that he's now going to yoga and studying meditation and investing himself in a spiritual life, his peers, his friends, find no way to understand that because they have experienced the necessity of dismissing everything religious. Now, I suspect that we're probably the only church on the face of the earth today where a Russell Brand quote was used in the liturgy as the wisdom lesson. But it was this comment he made about Joseph Campbell that seemed to really speak to our current challenge. The stories that have come down to us in the Bible, from wandering Palestinian shepherds and barely settled agricultural societies of first century Judah, no longer have the power that we've tried to give them. And for the last 200 years, they've been losing power, and that's when people begin to ratchet up the claims that God wrote them. Biblical inerrancy is a creation of the last 200 years. That it was only when these myths, these stories, began to lose their authoritative power in a scientific era that we started to ratchet up our ridiculous, superstitious claims about the nature of those texts. So Campbell's observation that we need new communal myths to guide us, that seems to be right on to me. That where do we go for moral authority now? I don't know that you can invent a myth. I don't know that you can just say we need new myths, so let's write some. So what I've tried to do is to replace those with modern biographies. The recent release of the movie Selma seems like a good example. The problem, however, with lifting up any modern leader into that role is that we've got access to too much information about their faults. Jesus may have been guilty of all kinds of personality flaws. He may have participated in the racism of his culture at the time, of the exclusivity of Jewish superiority. He may have, but he's hidden in the fog of 2 millennia of told stories and repeated aspects of him. But when you talk about Gandhi or Martin Luther King, or even such bright lights as Dorothy Day or Mother Teresa, it's not hard for us to enumerate their failings. We have difficulty in appreciating anything that anyone does without also trying to wallow in our perspective of their salacious footnotes or Achilles' heels. This is almost as true of public figures as it is of religious leaders. Though he has recovered a lot of his current popularity, history will remember Bill Clinton more for his tryst with Monica Lewinsky than it will from rising up from a single-parent household in poverty in Arkansas to inhabit the White House. An amazing story with a lot of accomplishments in its tow, but we will remember the most dirty and salacious aspects of his history. We've watched the conservative world trying to find a good soft place in Barack Obama where they can stick a dagger in for the last 6 years. And their attempts often seem rather desperate. Recently, Mike Huckabee criticized Obama for poor parenting because he's allowed his children to listen to Beyonce's music. And Mike Huckabee has a kid who, when he was a teenager, captured the neighbor's dog, hung it, and tortured it to death. But he thinks that the Obamas are bad parents. I don't think he's going to win that finger-pointing contest at the local PTA meeting. We have got to be able to praise an 18-year-old John Lewis who knelt in prayer on the Evans-Pettus Bridge during the Selma March while the Alabama State Police broke his skull with batons. We have to be able to tell the story of Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat on the Montgomery, Alabama bus that started the bus boycott that then fueled the civil rights movement without trying to rifle through their garbage to tell ourselves that we don't need to follow their example. Gossip is used to destroy the reputations of leaders to give all the rest of us a pass on our own shortcomings. We've got to rise above those false diversions so that we can be more concerned about virtue and less concerned with trying to drag everybody else down. And I'm guilty of it too. I can tell you the 21st century is starved for myths and examples for us to follow. And one of the real rising stars is our current Pope. And I've resisted liking him because I don't think he did enough to protect liberation theology priests when he was in South America. But if I really believe my own preaching, you've got to leave room for people to change. Now, it would help me a lot if he would admit that he didn't do enough to protect those liberation theology priests. But, popes are infallible, so he's not likely to admit that he did anything wrong. But we've got to recognize that this guy is stepping up to the plate and swinging the bat for social justice, and that's a good thing, regardless of what he may not have done 30 years ago. All the while, if we don't create people to look up to, our culture will create false heroes for us. At the same theaters that are now showing Selma, larger crowds by far are going to see American Sniper, a hero tale about a man who evidently killed upwards of 200 Iraqis. The self-aggrandizing autobiography of a soldier who claimed to have beaten up Jesse Ventura in a bar fight, which has been disproven in a court of law, or who claimed to have killed 2 carjackers in Texas, an event for which there is no record, who claimed to have been a sniper killing looters during the Katrina flood that he was not anywhere near, none of which was true, leading up to his claims that the proceeds from his book would go to veterans' causes, and evidently he is his favorite veterans' cause. Clint Eastwood claims that the movie is not political, but the Twitter feed that has followed from people that have seen American Sniper, repeatedly people come out of it saying they now love America 100 times more and hate Muslims 1,000,000 times more. That young people are seeing that film and saying that their now life cause is to find an opportunity to shoot towelheads or Arab Muslims. When there is a vacuum of real heroes in modern culture, we will make heroes out of people we should not admire. Athletes, movie stars, rock stars, and snipers may be pushed up in public consciousness because they're famous or because they're wealthy or because of braggadocio they're portrayed as being brave. But in my experience, this exchange with my housekeeper this week is more impressive than what I've seen out of movie stars or war heroes or athletes lately without inflation or deflation issues with footballs. I cannot believe how much we're talking about that. Here, somehow, was a woman working at the lowest rung of employment in the United States, whose natural reflexes were to sacrificially do the right thing. I'll say it again, to commit an act of supererogation, because you know you're going to want to use that sometime this week. My question as a spiritual teacher is, how did that happen, and how can we make that happen more often? How can we instill that kind of character, that selflessness, that conscientiousness in more people? What are the stories you tell to inspire that kind of decision making? Largely unchurched Western Europe seems to do a much better job of showing compassion to the poor, to the mentally ill, and even their criminals. Criminals are treated so much more humanely in Western Europe than they are in the United States. And the United States is a heavily church-populated country. But it doesn't have to be that hypocritical. My fear is that without spirituality, pure reason can lead to a moral vacuum. We just have to acknowledge that there are good myths and there are bad myths. There are popular role models who are dangerous, and there are others whose virtues are to be praised and imitated. And there are very unhealthy forms of religion. And yet, religion can be the vehicle for teaching moral decision-making. As the famous scholar Karen Armstrong has written, if your understanding of the divine made you kinder, more empathetic, and impelled you to express sympathy in concrete acts of loving kindness, that's good theology. If your notion of God made you unkind, belligerent, cruel, or self-righteous, or if it led you to kill in God's name, that's bad theology. Let's not leave the future up to chance. Let's think, be critical in our thinking, be analytical about our lives, and then act, following in the pathway that leads to liberation, courageous compassion, nonviolent transformation, and into a consistently loving community. Our progressive faith should liberate us from bondage to old myths that no longer work in our modern society, but that liberation should not lead to either cynicism or rabid individualism. Together, we really must learn anew how to be the people we always inherently admired for their good deeds, and learn again the way of living that leads us all into a loving community.
You have been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at Reverend Dr. Ray at AOL.com for more information.